Welcome to In the Name of the Law, with your host, Liisa Speaker from Speaker Law Firm. Joining her today is Stephen Sinus from Sinas Dramis Law Firm, Amy Bailey from Bailey and Terranova Attorneys at Law, and Mary Chartier from Chartier Nyamfukudza, PLC. Now, let's discuss some remarkable stories and real cases.
Welcome to In the Name of the Law, a legal talk show sharing real-life stories. Today we're going to talk about all different kinds of loss. Loss of life, loss of liberty, and loss of a marriage. Stay tuned for more.
In the name of criminal defense.
Today we're going to talk about the case of Dennis Temasek, who was accused of criminal sexual conduct with a child under 13. He was convicted and went to prison. And today I have with us a team of attorneys and staff who worked on his case from the law firm of Chartier Nyamfukudza, Lizzie, Takora, Mary, and then we also have a really special guest. Kim Temasek is the wife of Dennis, and she spent 9 years after work every evening going through the files, going through case law, trying to find a basis to free her husband from prison. And so we really wanted to talk to everybody today about the whole process of what happened with Dennis's case. Can you give us a little bit of an overview, Mary?
Sure. So we weren't the first trial team. So Dennis had a different lawyer. He was convicted, and then he was in prison for 9 years. Marty and Chris Tieber, two amazing appellate lawyers, worked pro bono for 9 years to free Dennis and get his convictions reversed. And then we stepped in for his second trial, and we were the trial team on that part of it. Dennis was accused by a teenager who had a lot of troubles. He had been accused and caught stealing from school, had a drug history, a number of issues. He was seeing a counselor. The counselor was asking particular questions. He said he had been molested by a neighbor when he was a boy, and that's why he was acting out. Ultimately, the parents got involved. They remembered that this boy had gone over to the Temasek household, less than a handful of times when he was younger. And then that's how Dennis and his family get unfortunately roped into this nightmare.
Right. Now, Kim, can you tell us what you thought when Dennis was first accused of this horrific crime?
Well, first we were like, where is this coming from? Like, we had no clue. And as time went on, we learned that he had been arrested for stealing from the school, from the cheerleaders' purses, and the school was pressing charges. So basically that was his motive. He needed an out.
And so this was, what we're saying is the accusations came about how many years after they allegedly happened?
Well, when they first brought Dennis in, they said 5 years. Then they said 10 years. So they didn't really know at first. So then they came up with 06, I believe, or
about 10. So I think
so
wasn't it
10
about 10
years?
94 was when the first.
They were claiming 10 years prior.
So you're basically trying to piece together what you and your family were doing 10 years before to.
Well, it wasn't really difficult. He'd only been at my house a couple times, so there was no, our thought was, this is crazy. The police will do their job and this will just go away. This family had a lot of issues. There was police there often.
And Dennis was rarely ever at home because he worked so much. I have never seen a schedule like his before. There were months where he would only be home. He would have days off maybe 2-3 times a month, and that was it. So he was rarely ever home during these times that the accuser was claiming he was being molested.
He was the sole provider. I didn't work. I was a stay-at-home mom. So that was the thing too. I'm at home with these kids all the time. These kids are with me 24/7 pretty much. I know who's in and out of my house. I know what goes on, and when Dennis is home, he's mowing the lawn and he's outside most of the time.
At 1 o'clock in the morning, right?
Right. One of the issues that came up, and this was not presented in the first trial, but it was in the second trial, is the neighbors called Dennis nocturnal because he would get home from work so late. Because the complainant said this happened after school, but Dennis, as Lizzie said, wasn't even home. So he would get home from work so late that he would have to mow his lawn, and he would strap flashlights onto his lawnmower, and he would be mowing the lawn at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, which the neighbors loved, right?
Not typical, probably.
Right.
That was his lifestyle.
So Dennis was convicted in 2006. What was that like for you and your family?
It was devastating. Like first of all, there was the accusation. So throughout that year, we're just thinking, okay, this is going to just come to an end because it's crazy. It doesn't even make sense. So it was devastating. When we went to trial, and as we're going, we knew nothing. We had never had any issues with the law. We've never had lawyers, anything. So we were very naive to the whole situation and how it all works. So we just assumed that, the police will investigate, they'll do their job, this will, and they did go out and talk to people, but they just ignored what people said and went forward. So
when Dennis was interviewed by the police, he said he was at work, right? So he said, listen, I'm not home when the kids are there after school. I'm at work. And so what did they never do? Go to work.
They never went to work. I mean, the business ultimately shut down, and I was hunting down sounds bad, but I ultimately interviewed over 30 people who were thinking back over 20 years. But everybody was willing, friends, neighbors, and people who at the time were children, now adults. Everybody was helpful. But yeah, never spoke with the police.
Lizzie, Takura, other members of the team, Kim, Tony, they interviewed so many witnesses and hunted down probably is a good word. One woman kept telling Takura that it wasn't her. He had the wrong number, but we knew it was the right number, so he would not be dissuaded. He ultimately just went to her house. And then she liked you so much, she invited you to dinner.
Tea, yeah, that's right.
So,
tea and scones.
what ultimately persuaded the court to grant him a new trial? So you were, that was Marty's team was working on getting a new trial, right?
Right. So a case called Musser came out, and it was considered to be a Musser error. So Dennis was interrogated, and the officer kept saying, I investigated this case, I know you did it. But at that time, the detective hadn't investigated anything, and so the court held that it was inappropriate for the jury to hear the detective's statement that she knew he did it. She investigated this case thoroughly, when one, that hadn't happened, and two, she didn't know anything because Dennis didn't do it. And we were able to prove that at the second trial.
So obviously it's important to get the new trial and whatever technical basis it might be on, but even more importantly, there was a lot of work that went into preparing for that second trial. So, tell us about the team and what you did to show, the labor of love that Kim had made for 9 years.
One of the things that Kim had was a receipt from a bike purchase that had to do with one of the claims that the accuser had. And we had proved that that bike hadn't been purchased yet when he said this happened. But in order to do that, because Kim kept the receipt from 1995, because she's wonderful, we had to track down the original owner to get that to be certified by him. So, and he had retired in Florida.
There is so much about this case. I think we could talk about it, and there are so many really important aspects of it. If folks are interested in learning more, check out our podcast, Constitutional Defenders. We're on iTunes. You can also go to our website, cndefenders.com, and you can learn more from Kim, Dennis, and the entire team.
Thank you so much for your hard work and for coming on with us today, Kim.
thank you.
In the Name of Criminal Defense is brought to you by Chartier Nyamfukudza, PLC. In the Name of Personal Injury Law.
We're here today with Steve Sinus, a personal injury attorney at the Sinas Dramis Law Firm, to talk about the Michigan Wrongful Death Act and what happens when a family member dies because of someone else's wrongdoing. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about the rights of family members when a loved one dies in that context?
Absolutely. So we handle wrongful death cases at our firm. And one thing I see is that people come in not knowing much about how this process works. Some people just assume that we have this right. Maybe they almost think it's from the Constitution or whatever it may be, that we have a right to pursue an action against someone who causes the death of our loved one. Actually, the reason why we have that right is because of the statute, the Michigan Wrongful Death Act. I think all states in America have a Wrongful Death Act statute, but it took the legislature passing a bill to give these families some rights in the civil realm to pursue damages against those who caused the death of their loved one.
So what kind of damages or rights do the families have specifically?
So under the Michigan Wrongful Death Act, you can first start with the person who dies. The law provides them the right to pursue on behalf of the estate. The estate is what's opened up for the deceased person. And the estate can pursue a claim on behalf of the deceased person for pain and suffering damages that person experienced leading up to their death. Sometimes death is instantaneous. With a vehicle crash, the person might be killed instantly. Sometimes people live for several months and then die. It's in those cases where you pursue that type of pain and suffering damages on behalf of the decedent. But when there's a death, the family members have rights. Dependents, which would include spouses and children, have a right for economic damages. So if the deceased person was bringing in income and the other people were relying on it, they would be the dependents, and they can claim the compensation for that loss of income. Now, there's also this class of interested persons, which include the person's parents, their children, their siblings, and grandparents. All those people have a right for loss of society and companionship damages. So the Michigan wrongful death law says, okay, if you fall in that class and someone dies in your family, you can pursue damages for your loss of that relationship. Those are essentially the rights under the wrongful death law.
Okay, and so what is the process for pursuing one of these cases?
Well, it's not that you can just walk into court or just go ahead and pursue these rights if you're a family member. You have to go through the formal process, which begins with filing a petition in the probate court to open an estate on behalf of the deceased person. And so that's a pretty simple process, but you still have to do it. And then the court creates the estate, and that's the legal entity that is representing the interest of the deceased person. And then the court has to appoint a personal representative. Were you going to ask?
Well, I was going to ask about what kind of deadline is there to do this?
There's a bunch of timelines, and you have to notify family members, and so none of it is intuitive, right? So you have to consult with an attorney, you got to go through the probate rules, and then the appointment of the personal representative is a very important moment where the court says, okay, this person is going to represent the interests of the estate. That's the person that has the power to act on behalf of the estate.
And this person is the personal representative of the estate of the deceased person,
That's right.
Okay.
And there can be fights in the probate court about who that person is. But once that person is appointed, they are the ones who have authority to pursue the wrongful death action. So it's quite a process. But once you get it going, then it can be pursued.
So what is it like to represent these families who have undergone such a sad loss to their family member?
I can tell you it's a very emotional experience. And if you're really going to do your job well as a personal injury attorney handling wrongful death claims, the experience should be one where you immerse yourself into that family, because you have all these rights to pursue, and you have this family that has been inflicted with this sudden tragedy, and you really need to connect with them, because you got to do it to do your job. You have to do it to make them feel that you actually understand, or they're trying to understand. I don't think you can ever really understand. That's one thing I've learned, is that you can always try to understand. But those who are, subject to the loss, they're going through something you can't really fully understand, but you do everything you can. And you really have to know the relationships each person had with that decedent. You got to know about the history of that family, and even before that person was born. Where do they come from? What are they about? What were their interests? And so it's a rewarding experience, but it's one that you really have to be genuine and connect with the family on.
So can you give us any examples of real life cases?
Yeah, I can think of 3 really heartbreaking cases. I mean, there's others, but I'm going to talk about these 3. Give you some quick fact patterns. A farmer, his family had been farming in the area since 1840. And one day he was on his tractor doing his job, lawfully going down the road, and a semi-truck comes barreling down the road. Why the semi doesn't see him, nobody knows, but he barrels into him and he kills him. And that was just horrific. And I'll get to more about what we did with that case. The other one is this couple, and they get a call that the husband's father, who lives up north, was about to die, and he had been ill, and that they need to go up and give them their last wishes. So they get in the car, and they're driving up the highway, and a semi-truck barrels into the back of them and kills the husband.
On his way to see his father on his deathbed?
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, you hear about these fact patterns and they come in, and you can't imagine that actually can happen, right? Mm-hmm. So the father had to get the call that his son wasn't going to come see him because his son had died. Mm-hmm. And I guess the father's last days were so much more horrific because of that, him knowing his son was dead. The other one is a young father. I'm a young father, and they were up north on a family vacation, and this vehicle, it was a commercial vehicle, blew a stop sign. And the kids were in the car, and the dad died. And I mean, these are things that they're too heavy to almost talk about. So when you think about what it means to represent these families, you then think about these horrible fact patterns, and then you have to think about what are their rights. And just to be clear about that, you can pursue a claim if it's in a traffic situation against the driver who caused the crash, the owner of the vehicle, and if they're employed, their employer. And the reality is that your right is against them, but in most of these cases, if there's a recovery, it comes from insurance coverage. So when you litigate these cases, the insurance coverage isn't something that gets to be talked about in court, but that's the reality of whether there's money to recover.
Well, let's talk about court for a minute. So you mentioned 3 different cases. Did all of them go to a jury trial?
A lot of personal injury cases settle before then because the people on the other side know that there is a very compelling case and that they don't want to have a jury decide how much should be paid. So those cases actually were litigated to some extent, but all 3 of them were resolved prior to trial. In a favorable way to the clients, but money doesn't replace, but I will say that the representation of these families lets their story be told and gives them some type of compensation that's a token of their loss. It is not a one-for-one exchange ever, but at least is some type of recognition.
Does it help with closure?
I think it does. I think the process can be one the legal process can be one that almost like prevents closure for a little while, but once it happens and once they see that the representation has been, has meaningfully told their story and the loss of their loved one, they feel that that was the right thing to do. And it does help them move on in life. That's the truth, It's not about money, but it's helping about moving on.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for helping these families and sharing how the Wrongful Death Act works for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In the Name of Personal Injury Law is brought to you by the Sinas Dramis Law Firm. Go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics and to view other In the Name of the Law episodes. In the Name of Family Law.
I'm here this morning with Patrick Bailey and Amy Bailey of Bailey Terranova, family law attorneys, and also Karen Gallagher, a mental health therapist. She is also the owner of the Wellness Institute of Michigan. So today we're talking about loss and life after divorce. And so I wanted to ask about the stages of grief. We've heard about the stages of grief when somebody dies. Are there stages of grief for somebody who's gone through a divorce?
I believe so. What we see in people, that the first stage is the denial. When a person has been served with divorce papers or their spouse has told them, I want a divorce, and they had absolutely no clue that there was something wrong with their marriage. They're in shock. What did I do wrong? We then see anger when they realize, okay, well, I'm getting a divorce. All right, well, watch this. And they start cutting people down. Very hateful things are said. The next stage that we see is bargaining, where people are telling themselves, is this really what I wanted to do? I didn't realize that I was only going to receive half of my pension. I didn't realize I was only going to see my children half of the time. The next step would be depression, and I would defer to Karen to talk about that.
So we describe the loss process. I agree with those stages. Those were created many years ago by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But in addition to that, we look at loss in terms of a primary loss and secondary losses. So the primary loss is actually the event itself, the divorce, and filing for the divorce. And then we have the secondary losses, which there are multiple secondary losses that come with divorce. And there are things like financial strain and changes. A family might go from 2 incomes down to 1 income. A family might also there might be moving involved with 2 parties, for example. There's also the financial losses in terms of not understanding what the bills are or how to handle them and those kinds of things. There are changes in relationships as well, and those include things like friends, coworkers, in-laws, extended family, and that can be difficult because other friends and family members might not understand how to relate to an individual on a single basis when they were married for so long. So that's a big change that the individual has to cope with. Traditions, holidays also are a big change for families, and that's a huge secondary loss. How do I handle Christmas or Thanksgiving without my children? Or how do I have a holiday and I don't know what to do with myself and how to spend time by myself? So those are the secondary losses that come with it.
I think it's also important for parents to recognize the loss that their children are going through. They sometimes get so consumed with their own thoughts they forget about the children. And that starts with working together to tell your children that you are going through a divorce. And Patrick and I would like to do a little skit showing what we believe is appropriate, an appropriate manner in which to tell your children.
So children, your mother and I have something important to tell you, and it's important we tell all of you as a family because this is a family decision.
we've thought about this long and hard. Your dad and I believe that it would be in everybody's best interest for us to have separate homes. You will have a home with your dad. You'll have a home with me. We'll be working together. We love both of you, and everything is going to be okay.
Think of it like this. It's two houses, but it's still one family. We love you all equally. We love you very much. You do not have to choose sides, mom or dad. You can love us both the same.
Then we also have in our practice the people that do not present as a united front. We'll have people that'll come in and they'll say, "You're not going to believe what my wife did. She had the children come over and she told them, your dad's a drunk, your dad's having an affair. I will protect you from him. He is rotten and he is insane." That does nothing to help children deal with loss.
So one of the things I've noticed a lot is that the judges in the state and probably around the country get really frustrated with parents when they hear things that make it sound like the parents are talking to the children about what's going on in the adults' lives. And so it sounds like your recommendation is like, keep all these squabbles away from the children. They don't need to be hearing about what the other parent did, because it's really between mom and dad. It's not between the children.
Right. The judges want the children to be children, and they want the adults to keep them out of the court proceedings. They don't want them to know anything about it.
Right.
And so many times we see the one parent asking, "Well, what'd you do at dad's house? What'd you do at mom's house? You can tell me." Or the mom says, "Don't tell dad.
Right.
Don't. It's none of his business." It's difficult.
And we've heard judges say, "Mom and dad, you guys are doing a great job screwing up your life, but the only thing I care about are your children, and so we need to put them at the forefront of all decision making."
So with such a dramatic change in the lives of the entire family, I'm wondering, do you recommend that people get into therapy very early in the process while the divorce case is just starting, and then maybe continuing beyond the divorce proceedings?
Absolutely, and we suggest too that even as the parents are contemplating divorce and they're trying to figure out how to discuss it with their children, that's even as early as we could go back to. But yes, what we're talking about is, for example, when the father is very angry or the mother is very angry, and I call it leaking out onto the children, and their emotions just, kind of come forward like that actually it falls back on the parents to resolve their own issues at that time. If you're still feeling a lot of anger or resentment towards your partner, your ex-partner at this point, and you have to blame them in front of your children, then you are not resolved, and you need to work through that. So we try to help the parents do that as well.
Right. So, because I do family law appeals, a lot of those cases are the highest type conflict cases that there are. They're not the cases that are settling. Can we bring the therapist in to help meet with the children and go through the process of if the parents just are not capable of having the skit that you did is the way it should be done.
Exactly.
But a lot of times we're not going to see those in the high conflict divorce cases. Can we bring the therapist into the room with the children and have them be with one of the parents to help explain the process?
Certainly, whatever works for the family. We encourage people to be involved with mental health therapists right from the very beginning, not just for themselves, but for the children, so the children have somebody that they can depend upon. Tell the therapist what concerns they have with mom, what concerns they have with dad. We encourage the therapist then to include mom or dad if they believe that would be beneficial for the issues that the child is dealing with. And we now have therapy for co-parenting, which is very important, I believe. A lot of people aren't really gung-ho about that, but it only benefits the children.
So that was great information, and hopefully will help a lot of families get through this process. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the Name of Family Law is brought to you by Bailey and Terranova Attorneys at Law.
We talked today a lot about loss and how difficult that can be to go through. Loss of life when somebody's wrongfully imprisoned, loss of life when somebody dies because of somebody's conduct, and even what it's like going through a divorce and what that loss will mean to a family, a spouse, and children. Do you have any final thoughts to share with us?
Well, one thing I've learned being a lawyer is that we all want to appreciate life and appreciate the time we have. And what loss is really about is when that time gets taken away from us in a way we don't want to have it taken away from us. And so when I'm thinking about all that was shared here today, I'm thinking about lawyers and clients who all had to fight for some type of compensation or remedy for what they've lost, because life is precious.
Mary?
What's interesting for the Temaseks is when you mention compensation, Dennis has been denied compensation under the Wrongful Imprisonment Compensation Act. The Attorney General has been fighting it tooth and nail. Right now, we're up at the Michigan Supreme Court hoping we can get him some money. But you can never get back the 9 years. His mother passed away, his son got married, his son had to forego going to college so he could help his mom raise his younger sister. I mean, the one takeaway I hope that people have is that when someone is accused, that does not mean that they're guilty. And I hope people who serve as jurors in the community really keep an open mind, because Dennis Temasek is not the only wrongfully imprisoned man in the state by any stretch of the imagination.
And it's important to remember it's not just his loss, it's his wife's loss, his children's loss, and all of his extended family.
And they did an amazing job for raising their children. Every night at dinner, they would put Dennis on speakerphone and they would try and have some semblance of normalcy, and told the children, you focus on school and we'll focus on the case. But 9 years he was away. I don't like being away from my family for 9 minutes. And 9 years he spent in prison.
Semblance of normalcy really brings us to the family law topic and what it's like for families going through divorce and that sort of loss, and the normalcy seems to go away.
That's
Amy?
correct. That's correct. As we've heard today, there's so many different types of losses that people can go through depending on their circumstances. And I think people need to realize when they're going through a divorce, it's okay to go through the stages of grief that we talked about. It's okay that your children come to you and they ask for comfort. I mean, that's what it's all about. We need to keep the continuity for the children and recognize that there's loss all around us. And some areas of loss are more egregious than just in the divorce, like we've heard in these other circumstances today.
Right. So, and as attorneys, obviously, we have to deal with families who have gone through loss on a daily basis. So I really want to thank all of you for sharing your stories with us today. And in some instances bringing a client on, and just really to help us see what they really went through going through that loss and really overcoming it if possible.
And thank you for the opportunity to share a wrongful conviction. I mean, the Temaseks went through just a nightmare and they've come out better on the other side. But I mean, he was wrongfully imprisoned for 9 years, and thank you for the opportunity to share Kim's story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Steve.
much.
Thank you for joining us today for In the Name of the Law. Please go to WLAJ.com for more information on today's topics, and please join us next week for another informative show.